Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Alyssa Doroff. I'm the cyber technical leader here at NFP based in New York City. I'm very pleased to have Paul Caiazzo with us here today from Avertium. Paul is going to talk to us about the state of ransomware, its geopolitical implications, share some real life stories, and finally, how best to counter these trends. For those of you who don't know Paul, he's the CISO and Senior Vice President of Corporate Development and focuses on technology alliances and strategic initiatives guiding Avertium clients through challenging security problems. Paul leads Avertium's internal security and compliance initiatives and works to reduce risk across the organization and its customers. Paul was a co-founder and CEO of TrueShield Security Solutions, which was acquired as one of the founding companies of Avertium. Under Paul's leadership, TrueShield earned a distinguished reputation as one of the fastest growing companies in the cybersecurity industry. Paul is a certified information systems security professional, CISSP for those who are not familiar, a certified information systems auditor, a certified ethical hacker, and he also has, as you can tell, 23 years of experience with an extensive background in the federal government and financial sectors. So we're very pleased to have Paul and his extensive experience here talking to us today. For those of you who may not be familiar with Avertium, they protect their customers, their data, their users, and even their supply chain with a security at your service mentality. They accomplish that by taking a programmatic approach to security maturity. Avertium is a leading provider of strategic managed security and security consulting services to the mid to large enterprises and public-private sector. Their team of highly certified security experts serves more than 1,200 customers in the healthcare technology, retail hospitality, financial services, manufacturing, and government contractor sectors. Managed security services customers benefit from their 24/7 monitoring at multiple redundant operation centers strategically located across the United States. Before we get started, just a quick note on logistics. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. With that said, I'm going to kick this over to Paul so he can get started.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa. Much appreciate the opportunity to talk to the audience today. So thanks everybody for attending. The background given was pretty much right on point. Just a couple things to add to that. I think one of the benefits that we bring to the table, at least as it relates to this conversation, is the fact that we monitor and manage environments across many, many different industries. And so being able to aggregate all that data allows us to produce threat briefings like what you're going to see today. So I intend to dive pretty deep into the ransomware ecosystem, give you guys a little bit of a peek behind the curtains of what happens, sort of behind the scenes within the ransomware as a service operations, talk about some trends and some statistics that we're seeing there, and then more importantly, talk about what you guys can do to protect yourselves. So I hope you find this informational, and please, if you do have questions, drop them in the chat, and we'll get to them towards the end of the conversation here. Let's see, there is a quick disclaimer to present to you guys which relates to the content that you're going to see today. But one way or another, obviously we have expertise in this, and take it with a grain of salt. But I think this will all be very applicable to what you guys have to protect within your own environments. So the state of ransomware. There are some statistics out there that you guys probably have seen either in the headlines or on the evening news. Ransomware is everywhere right now, and that's certainly not going to change anytime soon. It's a very profitable operation for the bad guys, with 2021 predicted damages above $20 billion, and about $1.5 billion in just U.S. ransomware demand costs in 2020 alone. One thing I will say is I participated in a ransomware task force with the U.S. Secret Service and the FBI yesterday, and a couple of new statistics have just come out that I want to share with you all. So over the last 5 years, the Secret Service was able to prevent about $25 billion in theft as it relates to ransomware and other cyber crime, and about $1.5 billion was returned to victims. So those are big, big numbers we're talking about here. From a targeting perspective, I was actually surprised to learn that 50 to 75% of ransom victims are small to mid-sized organizations. And I say I'm surprised by that because a lot of what we deal with at Avertium is what's referred to as big game hunting, which are the operators that do quite a lot of targeting and profiling and look for those juiciest targets that have a lot of money that they can quickly monetize. So 50 to 75% are in small to mid-sized organizations, and I'd imagine there's a healthy representation of that sector on the call today. So just be aware that this is certainly going to impact you guys at some point or another. So be prepared for it. There was a 20% increase in attacks that were actually reported to the U.S. Secret Service over the last 12 months, But the thing to know about that, so 20% might not sound like much, but that's really just the attacks that were reported. And the vast majority of attacks simply do not get reported to law enforcement for a couple of reasons that I am going to talk about throughout this talk here. But even with that 20% increase, there was actually a 200+% increase in the ransom demands themselves. So where you see that average U.S. ransomware demand of $84,000, what we've seen, and U.S. Secret Service and FBI confirmed for me this yesterday, is that the average that's actually being paid out is closer to $300,000 to $500,000. And that's a very significant amount of money. And if you think about, again, if the people that are being attacked the most are in the small to mid-sized organizations, $300,000 to $500,000, that's a very big hit to have to digest. Obviously, cyber insurance can help with some of that, but not every claim is going to be paid, and for a variety of reasons, many organizations just simply don't want to pay the ransom, and I can certainly understand that. I'm not a big fan of funding digital terrorism, and certainly ransoms are used to fund these organizations. And when I say organization, I really do mean organization. So you may have heard the term ransomware as a service, and what's really evolved over the last 24 months or so is this ecosystem wherein the people that are actually running these organizations are more akin to an organized crime lord than they are necessarily a hacker like you might be picturing behind a computer screen with a hoodie. The main team that you see on the far left there are the ones that are really funding these organizations. They're the ones that in some cases are either writing the malware or just simply purchasing it or funding the development of it. And then they make that available in truly an as-a-service model. And I'd imagine all of you on the call are familiar with software as a service and really consider this to be much the same as that. The ransomware is made available to groups that are called affiliates. And those affiliates generally have to prove a couple of things to the main group prior to them being even granted that affiliateship. One of the key things that the affiliates must prove, first off, they generally have to be Russian speaking. Most of these organizations operate in Russian-speaking jurisdictions, and they operate on underground and dark web forums that are primarily Russian-speaking. So that's sort of a barrier of entry to those that either don't, read Cyrillic or speak Russian. But there's probably some, something to read through or read into that if Russian language is a requirement. The other typical requirement is that the affiliate has to be able to prove that they can quickly monetize the ransomware. And so attacker motives are always important when you're thinking about protecting yourself, because different motives may carry with them different tactics, techniques, and procedures, and different attack objectives. But obviously with ransomware, the motive is money, and it's not generally attention. So if they're really focused on money and not necessarily attention, that's going to also have an impact on who they target and how they target them. A lot of the affiliates do have capabilities within their own ecosystem to go and do targeting, to go and actually break into the environments with their access and escalation specialists, and then ultimately steal data through exfiltration. But those that don't, or those that simply want to get to the finish line quicker, may simply just purchase access from another part of this operation called initial access broker. And what those groups are doing are effectively scanning the entire internet, looking for vulnerabilities. And typically those are going to be things like Microsoft Remote Desktop Protocol that's exposed to the internet. It could also be vulnerable VPN infrastructure. And there's two key factors with those specific technologies to think through as it relates to the world's current environment. So the pandemic, forced everybody to work from home. And so most organizations had to come up with some way to grant remote access to their environments so they can keep operating. In a lot of cases, that's through VPNs, or it might be through remote desktop. Bad guys know that certainly as well. And so over the last 12, 24 months, we've seen quite a lot of vulnerabilities that are focused on those specific technologies. So one thing to take away from this conversation today is you're looking at your own attack surface. Think through how well secured your Microsoft Remote Desktop Protocol is. I would not expose it to the internet. And then secondly, your VPN infrastructure. There are a lot of vulnerabilities that have been disclosed as it relates to VPNs, and you should definitely take care of those. So backing that up just a little bit here, you might be wondering, what's within this affiliate organization? What are these groups actually doing? And a couple of key things to note that, again, the U.S. Secret Service and the FBI, they're tracking about 20 to 25 of the major actors, those crime lords that I mentioned earlier, and that would be the main team. So 20 to 25 of these organizations that represent quite a lot of different variants of ransomware, and some of those groups that you see listed on the bottom there. There are many out there, but generally they all fall back within a relatively small ecosystem of bad guys that are all doing this. So that 20 to 25 different, cybercrime organizations works with about 200 to 250 affiliate organizations. And attribution of those individuals is quite challenging. And also because they generally operate in jurisdictions that are not friendly with the US government, there's almost never an actual consequence to any of these guys. So even if we are able to attribute a specific attack to an individual, very, very often is the case that nothing bad is going to happen to them. They're not going to be brought to justice. Unfortunately, that's just the case. But there are some success stories there. In that list at the bottom, a group called Netwalker, they actually did have some justice done to them within the last, I think, 6 months or so. In February, there was an operation between the FBI and Europol to bring some people to justice. But one key thing to note about that is that the individual that was prosecuted is actually a Canadian citizen who was operating in Canada. And of course, we have a good law enforcement relationship with Canada. However, those groups that operate out of Russia or former Soviet bloc countries almost never again have consequence. And those affiliates are doing several things in addition to just actually perpetrating the ransom and victimizing the victim organization. They're the groups that are doing the cash out services. They're doing the translation services between Russian and English. They're also doing effectively customer service. And the customer service I'll talk about later as it relates to what does it look like if you actually get ransomed and have to negotiate with these guys, because they do treat it as a business sort of transaction. They're also in some cases developing exploits or actually performing that access and escalation there. But the cash out is also important because at the end of the day, like I said, this is all about money for these guys. So they have to be able to take that cryptocurrency, launder it, and put it into fungible currency that can be used, US dollars, Russian rubles, whatever it is. So it's a very complex ecosystem, and it's built up simply because it makes so much money. A lot of the initial big game hunting ransom demands went into funding the research and development and really just the organization of these groups, and they're extremely profitable. But again, thinking through those couple key factors, if a lot of these guys operate in Russian jurisdictions and you have to prove that you speak Russian in order to be granted access to one of these groups, what does that really tell us? Well, to me, it tells me a couple of things. There's quite a lot of geopolitical implication that relates to what we just described here. One other aspect to know about ransomware is that most of the sophisticated malwares out there, including a lot of the ransomware, one of the things that they'll check upon execution is whether or not the system that they're actually victimizing has the Russian language pack installed as the default language. So in cases where the Russian language pack is the default language, the malware simply will not execute because there's an embargo within these groups. There are rules and procedures that they have to follow that Russia is off limits and Soviet bloc countries are off limits. So again, think that through. What does that really mean? It means in my mind that the Russian government certainly at least turns a blind eye because again, a lot of this is focused on disrupting Western interests or simply attacking Western commerce or Western commercial organizations for monetization. And in my opinion, again, I do believe that the proceeds of these ransom attacks actually does flow back into the Russian coffers. And on that prior slide where I talked about that ecosystem, know that if a ransom is paid, that ransom amount is shared amongst all of those groups. And different groups are more generous with their affiliates than others. Some of the main teams keep 20%, some of them keep 50%, and then share the rest with the rest of the organization. So that high focus on monetization and the desire to turn illicit access into money quickly doesn't really lend itself to attracting a high profile. And so I know everybody that's on this call probably followed along with the Colonial Pipeline attack that happened just a month or so ago. That was an extremely high profile incident that generated a lot of headlines, a lot of tough talk from the United States government. We actually enacted a state of emergency as it relates to that. And that's really counterproductive to the ransomware operators' motives. Because if you think about it, if the goal is to get money and that attack itself is so high profile that it potentially could create a sanction situation, that means that money that's been stolen might not actually be usable by the threat actors. And so it's really not in their interest to generate a high profile. And so as a result of that, we have seen some victimology that's changing. And I think that, again, sort of does relate back to the small and medium-sized business. They're generally not trying to attack critical infrastructure. And there are actually some embargoes against certain types of organizations like critical infrastructure, like government. Now, that being said, those rules are not always followed, and Colonial Pipeline is a good example of that. The Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department is another good example of a government organization that was ransomed recently, and that was by the group Babuk. So Colonial Pipeline was ransomed by DarkSide, and DarkSide, after that whole situation occurred, they basically sort of retired or basically shut down their operation because, again, they didn't want the high-profile attention upon them. As a result of that, there was quite a lot of infighting within the ransomware groups on the dark web during that time frame. And many of the underground forums where cybercrime is again, sort of orchestrated, kicked a lot of the crypto locker groups off of those forums because they simply didn't want the attention or the heat that came with it from Europol and other international law enforcement organizations like that. So you may be asking yourself, well, then who is actually being victimized? And I think this is a good depiction of that. So we profiled about 1,000 attacks in the first quarter of this year. And just note that is not the entire universe of ransom attacks. It's really just the ones that we profiled. There's many more than that. But what we observed within that is that the group that was most prolific is a group called Conti. And Conti has made hundreds of millions of dollars in ransoms over the past year, 2 years. And that's actually not an outlier. Many of these organizations earn hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of this. And again, if you think back to that first slide where I talked about the total economic impact of ransomware, we're talking billions and billions of dollars. So each of these very successful organizations does earn quite a lot of money doing this. But as I look at this, you see a couple of really standout sectors. One is manufacturing and the second being professional services. And when I think about targeting and profiling from the attacker's mindset, I think to myself a couple of things. If I'm a bad guy that's really focused on money, I'm going to be looking for really, I think, two characteristics. One is the capacity to pay. So is this a well-funded organization that generates a significant amount of cash flow, has revenues, likely to have an insurance policy that could potentially cover a loss, and also potentially less prepared or less well defended against this sort of attack. And I think manufacturing is a standout in that regard. Manufacturing typically, they're organizations that almost certainly have insurance. And then secondly, a lot of those environments, in my experience, have operational technology or other legacy type systems that are less well protected, just from a defense standpoint. And that, I think, is because the majority of the cybersecurity industry is focused on information technology and not necessarily operational technology. So, machines that might be making things or producing a good, while they may be internetworked, they may be less well protected. And then professional services is a very broad category. And it could include, your accounting firms, your consulting firms. I tend to also include legal within that, and you see legal on there as well. And I think the other thing to keep in mind here is what's the attack sequence that's currently known as double extortion, where data is stolen at the same time as the actual ransom attack happens. So the interesting thing with that is, if an organization is likely to have some interesting intellectual property, like a manufacturing company might, or some very interesting personally identifiable information or other sensitive data, like a law firm or a professional services organization or a healthcare organization might, you see that they do sort of rise to the top in terms of the victimization that we see. And again, if you balance that against the statistic that I mentioned earlier, that 50 to 75% of attacks target small to medium-sized businesses, put yourself into this slide here someplace and think through if you're within one of these industries, what are you doing to better protect yourself? And the way I always like to look at that is, again, put yourself in the attacker's mindset and try to understand, specifically what tactics, techniques, and procedures that specific group uses against that specific sector. So we wanted to take that one step further and look at the main ransomware groups that are out there. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but we looked at the different attacks that we profiled in Q1 and balanced that against the different named groups that are out there and a couple of the big names. Let's talk about DarkSide, for instance. So DarkSide, again, was the organization that ransomed Colonial Pipeline. Colonial Pipeline, I would typically put in that manufacturing sector. And there is sort of the bronze that's shown here. So bronze, DarkSide. So we see some concentration of DarkSide within a couple of specific sectors. Why that's important is that each of these groups, they have slightly different tactics, techniques, and procedures, which are really, those are the actions that the attacker takes to achieve their objective. And like I said, the objective within ransomware is to gain illicit funds or steal data for the illicit proceeds that's negotiated through ransoms. So if we understand, for instance, that I'm in a manufacturing organization and I know that these groups are attacking my specific sector, I can go and learn a little bit more about like what DarkSide does. What is their typical entry point, or what do they typically do to gain that initial access or break into an environment? Similarly with Conti, what is the attack sequence that these guys use against my specific sector? And you can learn all that stuff by looking through threat intelligence, looking also through some frameworks that exist. One specifically that I really like is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And if anybody has questions about how to use these within your own environment, I'd be happy to answer some of that. Also just happy to give you some links to go perform your own research. But again, if you understand what the bad guys are doing within your specific sector, you're going to be better able to protect against it. And that ultimately is what we're all trying to do. So take that into account. If you do that extra little bit of research, or even just use this slide to go and figure out which attackers might be targeting your organization, your sector, you can generally be a little bit ahead of the vulnerabilities that they try to exploit to gain entry to you. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is what's called double extortion. And this is by far and away the most common ransom scenario that we see playing out day in and day out now, wherein initial access is gained. That may be through a phishing attack. Somebody clicks a link. That's still one of the more common ways that these attacks sort of begin. But also, like I mentioned, the publicly facing applications like remote desktop or VPN infrastructure are very commonly exploited. So make sure you understand, how you're protecting yourself against that. What the bad guys typically do once they've broken in is spend quite a lot of time performing reconnaissance. And during that phase, they're going to be looking around the entire environment for all of the juiciest information that they can possibly find to steal. And that data could include personally identifiable information. It could include intellectual property. It could also include information like your insurance policy. We've seen that happen quite a bit recently, where the bad guy breaks in, goes and finds the finance share, and happens to find the insurance policy document and learns how much insurance that victim has. And then they actually do use that during the negotiation. I've seen that happen, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes here. But once they've gotten all that information that they would like to steal, they do what's called staging. And staging is where data is drawn from different areas of a network into a single place so that they can then steal it or exfiltrate it. They do that staging so that there's not multiple different points of exfiltration, which a sophisticated defense or security operations center might be able to identify. But if it's a single exfil or single point of theft, it generally can be a little bit more difficult to pick that out. And so get it all out at once. And then ultimately, once they've taken that, they've got the data in their hands. That's when the actual ransom is executed. That's when you fire up your machine, you find the ransom note on your desktop. So that's generally how these things work. And then, of course, there's the whole process of recovering from this, and that might include negotiating a ransom, which I will speak about. But one thing to note is that each step in this kill chain provides the good guys an opportunity to detect that this activity is happening. If you're prepared for it, you know what to look for. And that's an area that we can also provide some guidance on if people would like to engage in a conversation on that. So just a couple thoughts on what creates these incidents. I see this happen time and time again. Like, what's the recipe that actually generates this incident? And some of the more common problems that I see creating incidents like this are what's shown on the screen here. So I'll talk through each of these. So inconsistent controls. What I'm really talking about there are security controls that might be applied differently in different areas of the network. Most organizations now have some on-premise technology, maybe in a data center. They may have a managed services provider or some cloud environment that's doing something else. They may have some software as a service. Maybe they're using Office 365 for email, et cetera. And then, of course, they've got users working from home. And security controls are probably not consistently applied across all of those. And unfortunately for the good guys, we've got to be right 100% of the time. And the bad guys just have to get it right once. So that little bit of inconsistency can create some really big gaps that a bad guy can wedge into, and then create major problems for the organization. Other common problems relate to the attack surface. So the attack surface, if you're not familiar with that term, is every potential point of exposure that you may have to the outside world. So that could be your internet presence. It could be a laptop in somebody's home office that is sitting on public Wi-Fi or their own home Wi-Fi that is not necessarily connected to the corporate network, and it could be any variety of things like that. It's really critical that you do know that, and in more situations than not, we see organizations just don't have a good feel for what their full attack surface is. So what your entire potential exposure to the internet is, the way that we recommend typically looking at that is doing what's called open source intelligence gathering. And there are some tools that are out there that you can use to determine, what your external footprint actually looks like to a bad guy. I think that's a useful step for any organization to take. Again, put yourself in the shoes of the bad guy and look at yourself from their through their lens. What would you look like to them? And then, of course, you've got to be able to manage that attack surface. So keeping up with vulnerabilities. Poor hygiene is so often a problem. Just keeping up with patches can really solve many of these issues. And then also just minimizing the attack surface. So in most cases, there's more stuff exposed to the internet than needs to be. And so it's important to try to draw that down and minimize your footprint as much as possible, because then it just makes the job easier. You have less to patch, you have less to maintain. Lack of muscle memory. So what do I mean by that? What I'm really speaking about there is preparedness, and the incident response plan is really the key underlying thing there. I find a lot of organizations don't even have an incident response plan, which is sort of step one in this whole process. But the thing with the incident response plan is it's not just a piece of paper; it's something that's got to be practiced, and that practice yields muscle memory. Because at the end of the day, if you do have a situation where maybe a piece of malware gets onto a machine, as I mentioned earlier, that kill chain provides a lot of points of detection. And if you've got a good process and you've practiced it, you might be able to detect something bad happening before it becomes an actual ransom. And then execute the incident response plan and clean the environment up before it becomes a major crisis. And a lot of times, what also is a problem is coverage gaps. So I talked about sort of unknown technology within an organization's environment. I've seen time and time again where an organization might have a very good endpoint protection technology, but has forgot to deploy it to every device in the environment. And then lo and behold, those devices that didn't have the technology installed upon them are the ones that are ransomed. Or they may simply not have visibility to a specific segment of their network. And then that's the environment that actually gets the initial access that creates the whole problem from there. So it's really important to understand your environment and ensure that you've got technology and process covering all of it. Because otherwise, again, even the smallest vulnerability could create a wedge situation that the bad guys can get into. And the last one there is misconceptions. So, the misconception I see more often than not is, well, nobody would be interested in me. We're, a smaller organization. I don't have bad guys that are specifically targeting us. And that, might be the case. But the issue with that is it doesn't really matter if you're specifically targeted or not. If you've got a user that clicks the wrong link on the wrong day, you could wind up having an extremely bad, week trying to resolve an incident. So just get that misconception out of your mind. It doesn't matter whether or not you're being targeted or not. It's still incumbent upon all of us to protect ourselves and protect our networks. So otherwise, if you don't, what's going to happen is you're going to go through a situation that you'll, number one, learn a lot from, but number two, it'll be quite a stressful and disruptive situation in the meantime. So that all being said, so what happens if you've been attacked? So we've dealt with many ransomware situations that the organization simply wasn't prepared, didn't have backups that they could restore from, didn't have good logs that were able to support a forensic investigation, and ultimately had to negotiate with the ransomware group. And generally in conversations that I have with audiences, I'll ask the group to raise their hands if anybody in the room would be willing to negotiate with the ransomware actor. And very often I get one or two people that raise their hands. The ugly truth is, if you're not prepared and you don't have the backups or are able to reconstitute your environment, it's quite likely that you are going to have to negotiate, if for no other reason to understand what data the bad guys have. Especially in that double extortion situation, most organizations are going to have some privacy breach notification requirements upon them, and that's just going to get more complicated as more states have privacy laws released. So you really do have to understand what's been stolen. And if you can't get to or get through a good forensic investigation to identify that, you're going to have to negotiate. So generally what this looks like is in the ransom note itself, there will be a URL, which is generally an onion URL, so the dark web. And when you click that, you're taken to a website where effectively there's an e-commerce chat, and a chat application where you're going to be interacting with effectively a customer service representative from the threat actor organization. And they'll treat it like a business transaction. They'll purport to try and be helpful to their client, and their client in that case is you, although you're going to feel much more like a victim. And they're going to work with you to get you to pay. The demand is going to start, pretty high, and that will in some cases be dependent upon the revenues that the organization has. And the bad guys will spend some time researching this, especially if they've been in your environment for a while. They'll download financial information about the organization, and they'll know exactly how much money you have. They may also well know how much insurance you've got. And I've been in situations where the threat actor has said, listen, I know you have $5 million of insurance. I'm going to give you a discount off that, and I'm only asking for 3.5. And it'll go back and forth for quite some time. A couple of the key things to take into account is you do want to engage. If you're going to consider paying the ransom, you want to have sort of constant communication with these guys during these situations. It's not a situation where you lob a couple of IMs over to the bad guy and then walk away for a couple of days, because what they'll be doing in the meantime is putting your data and your company name out on their leak site, which is generally going to be a dark website where they publish who they've attacked, who they've victimized. And there are also just legitimate websites that track all that stuff. I know Avertium does, but also journalists that track it and will publish stories, on the clear web for people to go and read of who's been victimized by Conti or by Netwalker or by Ryak. So if you don't want your name on one of those sites, you're going to want to interact with these guys. And it's important to let them know that you're trying to work towards a deal, because otherwise it will start to get a little nasty. These are not generally pleasant negotiations, because they do know that they've got you over a barrel, especially if they've stolen data, because that's a double extortion, second point of leverage, where the threat actors learned over time that even less protected organizations may have learned that they've got to have backups that they can restore from. So the actual disruption to the organization from an operational standpoint might not be enough leverage anymore, which is partially why they're stealing the data as well. So they know that they can leverage the decryption key over you, and they know that they can leverage the leakage of your data. So what I've found is that if you go through one of these negotiations, typically what you can expect after significant back and forth is that 20 to 25% of the initial demand is what actually gets paid. But there are some certain circumstances which may shift that a little bit. If you are unable to recover your environment from backup or reconstitute it through rebuilding it, and you've got high degree of urgency to get back to operations quickly, the bad guy generally will be able to sense that if you're trying to get to the decryption key quickly. And the more urgent you are in needing the decryption keys, the higher the demand is going to be, and the less willing to negotiate they are. But bear that in mind. And one thing I will also say is that I generally don't advise a victim to try to negotiate this themselves. It's something, again, where muscle memory is important, and it's important to have gone through this more than once or more than zero to be effective at it. So generally, I would recommend engaging an expert to do this. It's something that we do for customers that wind up in situations like this. It can backfire on you if you try to negotiate it yourself. But one way or another, let's say you get to the point where you've agreed upon a price. What will happen then is the bad guy will give you their cryptocurrency address. Typically, that's going to be Bitcoin, but there, in some cases, are attackers that prefer other crypto coins. Monero is one that I've seen used pretty frequently because it's got some privacy built into it, above and beyond what you get with Bitcoin. With Bitcoin, the public ledger, people can see what amount of money is moving from which wallet to which wallet. And that's really, really critical information for law enforcement as they try to follow the money. But with Monero, that's much more difficult. So often I've seen the demands with Bitcoin being a higher amount and Monero being a discount on that, because it's easier for them to stay anonymous and to move the money in a way that's not going to attract law enforcement attention. One thing that we do when we've been in situations like this and the threat actor has given us their cryptocurrency address is share it with law enforcement. And I would recommend everybody that's in a situation like this do engage their counterparts in law enforcement. The U.S. Secret Service and both FBI can be very helpful in a situation like this because they have intelligence and tools that you might not have available to you, even if you've engaged a forensics expert firm. I do prefer to share the crypto address with law enforcement simply because it will further their investigations. We can do that anonymously for customers, where if they don't want to have their name brought into it, that's fine. But one way or another, that information is important for the law enforcement to get. But at that point, let's say you've transacted, you've sent the funds, you're going to get back a decryption key. One thing you should know is that those decryption keys are not always very reliable. where you might get it back and find that even through decryption, there's still some corrupted data. The act of recovering an encrypted environment through the decryption key can be challenging. It can take days. For large environments, it can take weeks. And that is reliant upon a couple of key factors. One is if there's what's called a universal decryptor, that means a single decryption key will be usable across the entire set of encrypted devices. But in some cases, that's not the case, and you have to have a different decryption key per system. And then tracking that is a logistical nightmare. And it's just not a heck of a lot of fun. So even if you get the decryption key, it's not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to be able to decrypt all systems. And then there is still some risk that if you pay, that they simply won't hand over the decryption key. Have seen that happen. Certainly FBI and U.S. Secret Service have ever articulated the same. That being said, the bad guys actually do try to maintain some level of reputation for what they would consider integrity. So they'll actually make good on their promise to provide the decryption key if you pay them. Some are better than that and others. But we have heard of situations where an organization has paid a ransom and not gotten the decryption key, or paid the ransom, gotten the decryption key, and then be ransomed again. So bear that in mind. And one thing you should know is that in situations like this, it's always a difficult business decision. Senior executives are going to be involved in this. Law enforcement, legal counsel will be involved in this. It's generally not something I can make a blanket statement on that says, don't ever pay the ransom. In some cases, your choice might be the business ceases to operate completely, or you pay a ransom. And those are never easy decisions to make, of course, because you are effectively funding digital terrorism. But in some cases, you just may simply not have a choice. So, all that said, this is not intended to be a gloom and doom, fear, uncertainty, and doubt conversation. There are some things that we can do to better protect ourselves. And as I look at thinking about protection, I break that into really 5 categories. That's what's listed on the screen here. Anybody that would like to engage in a deeper conversation on this, I'm happy to do so. But to give you some high level, what is within each of these. So start with preparation. That really is the most important thing here, is developing the incident response plan so that you can know exactly who to contact, when, and how, because communication is absolutely paramount when you actually get to a response situation, and you have to have practiced it. The other thing within preparation that's really important is the backup and restore. Test your backups, test your backups, test your backups. If you can't restore from them, you're going to have that urgency leverage in addition to the data theft leverage. You're also going to want to do security awareness training. Phishing is still a viable way for bad guys to break in. And if you're not doing that, your users are going to be a point of weakness for you. And then also it's very wise to have pre-negotiated a retainer with some forensics firm or some response firm that can help through an incident like this, because what you don't want to have happen is you see a ransom note on a desktop that, all of a sudden you've got a very serious situation in your hands, and you've got to go and negotiate a contract with a response company. I'm sure NFP can help with that by introducing you guys to somebody or an organization that can help with that. Certainly we can as well. From a prevention standpoint, there are some things to do. One of the most important is endpoint detection and response, or EDR. The reason for that is because anti-malware or antivirus, that sort of the traditional approach, is really not effective against ransomware, and especially the more sophisticated ransomware, because these are not like executable files that are sitting in a file system. More often than not, especially with these sophisticated attackers, they use fileless malware that operates directly in memory. And it's generally a PowerShell script that's going to just operate out of memory. It will never hit the file system. And if you're relying upon an antivirus scanner that's looking for a virus in a file system, it's just not going to work. The other thing to keep in mind is again, hygiene. So vulnerability management. Patch your systems. There are a lot of vulnerabilities that can be used during that sequence of an attack, including privilege escalation, other things that will allow lateral movement and things like that. It's really, really critical that hygiene is high on the list for your organization. Another one is email protection. So things like malware gateways in front of your email. There's also some specific technical controls around anti-spoofing. Those are called DMARC, DKIM, and SPF. All of those are important to have implemented in your environment. And if you have an MSP that manages that for you, make sure that they've done that. And then another, more sophisticated prevention scheme, but one that we, really believe in, is zero trust. And that's a conversation unto itself, but it basically creates a situation where, traffic or activity that is not explicitly allowed in a network just simply can't happen. And it's a great way to contain a potential attack to even just one system or no systems at all. All that being said, no prevention scheme is going to be perfect, so you have to have some ability to detect, which is the next section there. A technology that I described during prevention, endpoint detection and response, or EDR, can also be very useful to detect this activity because it's more behaviorally focused. So we're looking for attacker tactics, techniques, and procedures. We're not looking for specific files. We want to see the different procedures that bad guys are using to get to their attack objective, and there are some ways that you can do that through logging and monitoring and through XDR approaches, which is extended detection and response. That basically is taking telemetry from all different parts of the environment, mashing that against threat intelligence, and then doing something with that information. Generally going to be behaviorally focused, looking specifically for behaviors and not files or signatures. So let's say you detect something and you've got to move into response. So what does that look like? Number one, execute the incident response plan. Hopefully you've practiced it. You want to be quick, but you don't want to be hasty. You don't want to reboot systems, and that's really important because when you reboot a system, you're going to destroy forensic artifacts that will be really useful later on so that you can perform the root cause analysis. And root cause analysis is absolutely critical during a response engagement because we want to help solve the initial problem that created the issue in the first place. If you just simply recover operations as quickly as possible without doing the root cause analysis, you're going to wind up in a situation where this happens again, and we've seen that happen. So make sure that the root cause analysis is done, and then you can move into recovery. Recovery may include, paying the ransom. So again, just be aware that that's a potential, and so use some of the information I gave you on that prior slide, or simply engage experts, which is probably the safer way to do it. The experts should also be able to help you cure that root cause, which was discovered during the response process, so that you can ultimately reconstitute the environment securely. And I always look at situations like this. Might sound funny, but there's an opportunity here. If you have to reconstitute an environment from the ground up, you can build it right. Build it more securely, more resiliently, and that ultimately is a way that you can take some lessons from this very stressful situation to put it back into again, a more resilient environment that's going to be less vulnerable to a situation like this happening again. Those lessons learned are critical, and they should always also be baked back into the incident response plan. So some countermeasures that I talked about in the prior slide that you should be looking at if you're not already. So XDR, again, extended detection and response. It's not really sort of the traditional security monitoring that you may be familiar with through, basically a SIM. A SIM is definitely a key part of this, but there's more to it than that. It includes collecting telemetry from the network, from the endpoints, from remote devices, from your cloud environments, et cetera. And importantly, it's very behaviorally focused on those tactics, techniques, and procedures that I described earlier. Really heavily reliant upon threat intelligence as well. So one thing to be thinking about if you're looking at ways to solve this problem, that's a strategy. It's not a technology. It's one that we certainly believe in at Avertium. And then zero trust is another one. So this again effectively is a response to the pandemic, where we've got people all over the world working from home. Effectively the laptop that you're in front of right now is your network edge. These are devices that are interacting with effectively hostile networks. The internet at large is not a friendly place, and machines that are interacting directly with it need to be protected. And zero trust is a way to both protect those assets as well as provide them secure connectivity to the environments that need to be accessed. So if you've got users at home that need to be able to access the network or access a cloud environment, there are ways to do that in a zero trust sort of setting, which allows them to operate securely, but can also really simplify how you manage identities across a very wide array of different types of data sources. So with all that said, that's effectively the content that I wanted to get through today. So we've got about 15 minutes, and I'm hoping that there's some questions out there. I think I saw one or two pop into the chat. Alyssa, have any come in?
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. We did have one question, and then I do have a few questions. The one question we got is very specific. I'm going to ask it to you, but maybe you can address it a little more in the broader context,
Okay.
just regarding financial institutions or how information is kept secure. But the question specifically was, how safe are individual equity portfolios held by stockbroker institutions? So, I'll just kind of ask you from a financial institution's perspective and the companies that you work with in that industry vertical, maybe, some thoughts in that regard.
Mm-hmm, sure. So typically if a financial institution is going to be attacked, the actual funds within individual portfolios are generally not going to be at risk. I have seen situations where advanced persistent threats are focused on cryptocurrency exchanges. And so that maybe is a little bit broader way of answering the question. But an anecdote that I can describe here, some of you in the audience may know that North Korea is actually a very sophisticated cyber operator. And a handful of North Korean cyber professionals were focused on the financial sector specifically and cryptocurrency itself, and went after a bunch of cryptocurrency exchanges and were actually able to steal cryptocurrency from those exchanges. And I think it was over $1.5 billion that they were able to get away with. In my experience, when a financial institution is attacked, I've not seen a situation where individual portfolios have been at risk. Generally, again, in a ransomware situation, what the bad guys are trying to do is leverage the victim into paying. They're not trying to steal the money from accounts directly. That generally is going to be much, much more difficult to do because there are controls around moving money from account to account, especially from a customer account. I have seen situations where victim organizations have been victimized through what's called business email compromise, wherein the CFO or CEO is effectively tricked into paying a false invoice or wiring money out of the organization in a way that they shouldn't. But again, generally financial controls should prevent that sort of thing. But I have seen that up in the millions of dollars of BEC. But I haven't seen a situation where on the wrong end of a ransom attack, a personal investor or an account holder within a financial institution has had funds stolen from them.
Thanks so much. That was helpful. So I have a question. It's a question. Actually, there are two questions, and there are two questions I get a lot, and I'm curious what your perspective is on this. And I know you touched on it a little bit before, just in terms of the demands as far as ransomware, what the ransoms are in terms of dollar-wise being demanded. I heard some figure, some cybersecurity company had told me a while ago that now the number on average appears to be 20% of the company's overall revenue. And I know you also said that it could be, the amount of insurance and obviously what's publicly available. No, the numbers are all over the place. And I know in the beginning you had an average, but just curious if you have any particular insight as to that number.
Well, certainly revenues are going to be part of the criteria that the threat actor looks at in establishing that initial demand. I think it is definitely case by case, and it deals more with what the potential impact to the victim is. A couple of examples that I can give from some very high profile attacks. So Colonial Pipeline, that happened maybe a month ago or so. The demand on that was around $5 million, and what got paid was 4.4, which that's an eye-watering amount of money. But at the end of the day, I think that's a drop in the bucket as compared to what they could have demanded. And to me, that shows again a desire to get out of the spotlight really quickly for the dark side operators there. There was another attack that happened last year. It was actually an insurance company. I won't name them on this call, but I will say it wasn't anything to do with NFP, but another insurance company was attacked, and the ransom that they ultimately paid is rumored to be $40 million. And the thing which scares me about an insurance company being attacked is that is really, really rich information to help support targeting and profiling further victims. Because again, the bad guys, if they know how much an organization is insured for, that's going to help them sort of frame out what the likely demand is. I haven't seen, Alyssa, necessarily a direct linkage between a percentage of revenues and the demands that we typically see. I think it's really more about how much leverage they have over the victim. And a lot of that's going to be obvious to them during that initial negotiation phase, where if you're desperate to get that decryption key as quickly as possible, they're going to know they've got you again in a bad position, and the demand's going to be pretty high. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. One other question I had is, I know you touched on the FBI, and it's really interesting to me because from an insurance perspective, there's one carrier that I've seen, this is the first I've seen of it, that has a quote unquote kill switch bonus, so to speak, endorsement. So if they get the FBI involved and they get them involved early on, they almost get like a premium credit, or they get, they get a little bit of assistance money specifically directed to that. And I know you said earlier, obviously nobody wants to fund, terrorism and terrorist activity. I don't even mean to say terrorism, but I mean, there's a whole discussion that can be had regarding the criminalization of ransomware. And, we don't have time for that today, but I guess my question is really when to involve the FBI, because, from my perspective, just having seen so many of these incidents from start to finish, yes, ideally you do want to let the FBI know so there can be some attribution, and they can be, we started to see that with some of the funds that were paid for Colonial Pipeline that actually were traceable and were, taken back. But I think it's a catch-22, because as much as you want to get law enforcement involved and help them, if you're in the middle of an investigation, it potentially could compromise your investigation in terms of what information they might want. And also, more importantly, I think might put your company in the spotlight before they were really ready to put a press release out or, put any public information out in terms of, that they have their arms around the matter and it's been remediated. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that's very common, the feedback that we get, especially when dealing with our customers' counsel or their outside counsels, that they're concerned about handing over an investigation to law enforcement, or that they might wind up in a headline. The commitment that I've gotten from both FBI and Secret Service is that if they're brought in to support an investigation, they're there to support. They're not there necessarily to take over. They'll generally work with the incident response team that's performing forensics, and they prefer to have some live engagement with the incident response firm rather than just simply relying upon an incident report at the back end of the investigation. And the other thing the commitment that they do make is that the victim confidentiality is as important to them as it is to the victim. And so if the victim absolutely can't have public statement made by law enforcement, they'll certainly honor that. They won't put your name in headlines. So take that into account. One thing I have seen also, though, especially as it relates to outside counsel, is the desire for attorney-client privilege. And that's certainly an important thing to keep in mind. If you've been ransomed and you've had data stolen from you that could be personally identifiable information, let's say it's your customer information, for instance, you could wind up having some litigation that you've got to be thinking about. And if you do interact with law enforcement early on and provide them an incident report, for instance, that could end up being discoverable later on in litigation. So it's definitely something to be thinking about there. That's a situation that legal has to make that decision. And generally, we're not going to go and talk to law enforcement unless we've been given the clearance by our customer, or we'll do it just purely anonymously by sharing the indicators that we've got, which are typically going to relate back to cryptocurrency addresses, and potentially IP addresses or forum names if we can get to the level of attribution at that level. But they're there to help. They certainly want to. They want to bring these guys to justice just as much as you would like them to. Their job is quite difficult. And one thing I will say is that the more public-private partnership there is in this area, the better the problem is going to get. Because ultimately, if we're able to bring some of these guys to justice, there are fewer of them out there, and that's, I think, in everybody's interest. So, I do recommend interacting at some level, even if it's just sharing the indicators at the end of the incident. Their preference certainly is to be brought in earlier than that, though.
That's great. Really, really helpful for everybody listening on the call, because, like I said, it's a question that I get all the time. So with that said, I don't think we have any more questions. And Paul, I really just want to thank you. That information was super helpful. And I know for everybody on the phone, that was super helpful. And I can guarantee you that I will have follow-ups from my colleagues from this. But with that said, again, just want to thank you so much. Let everybody know Avertium is a trusted partner for NFP. They can clearly be an invaluable resource in helping your organization prepare for and quickly remediate and recover from a ransomware attack, as well as other cybersecurity incidents more broadly. If you're interested in learning more about how Avertium can help you, please feel free to reach out to myself, your local NFP broker, or Paul, and his contact information is right here. He can certainly get you in touch with somebody in his company. And with that said, just want to thank everybody again. Thank you, Paul. Let everybody know that there will be a recording of today's presentation available in 48 hours. So with that said, I'm going to close it out and tell everybody to have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alyssa.